I did everything right. That's the sentence that makes this hard to say out loud. I didn't rebel. I didn't spiral. I didn't burn bridges or make reckless choices I could blame later. I followed the path that made sense. The sensible education. The respectable work. The stable routines that look good when summarized in a sentence. If someone asked how my life turned out, I could answer without hesitation. And that, somehow, became the problem. Because when a life is easy to explain, it can be dangerously hard to feel. I remember the day I realized something was missing, not as a crisis, but as a pause. I was sitting at my desk, finishing a task I had done 100 times before, when the thought arrived quietly, if this is my life, why do I feel like a visitor? There was no panic. No sadness sharp enough to demand attention. Just a flat, colorless awareness. I had chosen the right life. I just hadn't chosen my life. I had been careful from the beginning. Not cautious careful. I listened to advice. I observed outcomes. I avoided mistakes by watching others make them first. When faced with options, I selected the one with the least uncertainty. The one that didn't require explanation. The one that made people nod approvingly. It felt mature. It felt responsible. It felt like progress. And for a long time, I believed that doing the right thing would eventually lead to feeling right. It didn't. Instead, I learned how to function flawlessly without ever feeling present. My days were efficient. Predictable. Safe. People trusted me because I was consistent. They relied on me because I didn't surprise them. I took pride in that. But consistency has a shadow side. It can become a substitute for honesty. I stopped asking myself what I wanted because I already knew the answer wouldn't be convenient. So I reframed the question. What's practical, what's sustainable, what won't complicate things? Those questions became my compass. They never pointed inward. I told myself desire was unreliable. That passion fades. That meaning is something you build after you secure stability. So I secured it. And waited. Years passed inside that waiting. From the outside, my life matured. From the inside, it thinned. I didn't feel unhappy. I felt irrelevant to myself. There's a quiet despair that doesn't hurt, it drains. It removes urgency. It makes everything feel optional, including you. I started noticing how often I spoke in conclusions rather than possibilities. How rarely I felt anticipation. How my future felt like an extension of my present instead of an invitation. People congratulated me on my discipline. On my restraint. On my ability to have it together. I smiled and accepted the praise. But at night, alone, I felt a strange grief for something I couldn't name. Not a person. Not a moment. A version of myself that never got the chance to exist. I remembered being younger and feeling pulled by ideas that didn't make sense yet, paths that scared me because they couldn't be justified immediately. I had dismissed those feelings as immaturity. Now I wondered if they were honesty. I realized how rarely I took risks that weren't calculated. How little room I left for curiosity. How much of my identity was built around not needing anything too much. Need felt like weakness. Desire felt like danger. So I chose correctness instead. But correctness has no pulse. I began to feel like my life was a well-organized room with no windows. Everything in its place. Nothing letting air in. The worst part was this, no one had forced me here. I couldn't blame expectations or pressure or circumstance. I had agreed to every step. That realization stripped me of excuses. If my life felt empty, it wasn't because I had failed. It was because I had optimized the wrong variables. I had optimized for approval over alignment. For stability over truth. For being right over being real. And the longer I stayed inside that structure, the harder it felt to imagine stepping outside it. Because stepping outside would mean admitting something terrifying, that doing everything right doesn't guarantee you'll arrive anywhere that feels like home. Once that thought took hold, I couldn't silence it. I started to see my life not as a success story, but as a careful avoidance of risk, including the risk of becoming myself. And for the first time, I wondered whether the cost of choosing the right life had been paid quietly, over years, in the currency of identity. Once I admitted that I had chosen correctness over truth, the structure of my life began to feel brittle. Not broken. Just fragile in a way I had never noticed before. I started seeing how many of my decisions were reactions rather than expressions. I reacted to expectations, to standards, to invisible rules I had absorbed so deeply that they felt like my own thoughts. When something inside me stirred curiosity, restlessness, a quiet desire, my first instinct wasn't to explore it. It was to evaluate it. Is this reasonable? Is this worth the risk? Does this fit the life I've already built? Most of the time, the answer was no. And every no felt responsible. That's the trap of the right life. It rewards restraint so consistently that you forget you're allowed to want. I told myself I was being grateful. That dissatisfaction was a luxury problem. That people had endured far worse and found meaning anyway. Those arguments worked until they didn't. Because gratitude, when used to silence yourself, becomes another form of denial. I noticed how often I avoided stillness. Not because I was busy, but because quiet brought questions I didn't want to answer. What do you actually want? Who are you without the structure you've built? If nothing changes, how do you feel about the rest of your life looking exactly like this? Those questions didn't feel dramatic. They felt heavy. And wait, unlike fear, doesn't push you to run. It makes you sink. The mental breakdown wasn't loud. It arrived as exhaustion. A fatigue that sleep didn't touch. A dull pressure behind my eyes during ordinary days. A sense that I was performing competence rather than living it. I realized how often I described my life using finished language. I've settled. I'm established. I've figured things out. Those words sounded final. Closed. They left no room for growth, only maintenance. And maintenance, when it's all you do, slowly erases intention. I began to envy people who were uncertain. Who were in transition. Who didn't have clean narratives yet. Not because their lives were easier, but because they were still open. My life felt complete in the worst possible way. I told myself it would be irresponsible to disrupt it now. That starting over was for people who had failed, not for people who had succeeded. But that distinction collapsed under scrutiny. What is success if it costs you presence? What is stability if it requires silence? What is maturity if it demands that you outgrow honesty? Those questions didn't come with answers. They came with discomfort. I noticed how defensive I felt whenever someone talked about changing direction. How quickly I justified staying the same. How tightly I clung to the idea that consistency was virtue. But consistency, I was learning, is not the same as integrity. Integrity requires alignment. Consistency only requires repetition. The moral dilemma sharpened painfully. If I continued living this right life, nothing terrible would happen. I would remain respected, secure, predictable. But I would also remain distant from myself. If I questioned it, truly questioned it, I risked destabilizing everything I had built. Not just externally, but internally. Who would I be without the story of being the responsible one, without the identity of someone who did everything correctly? That identity had protected me for years. Letting go of it felt like stepping into free fall. There were nights when I sat in the dark and imagined two futures. In one, I stayed exactly as I was. Life continued smoothly. Time passed quietly. In the other, I disrupted the narrative. I disappointed people. I confused myself. I risked regret. Both futures frightened me. But only one of them felt alive. I began to understand that my fear wasn't of failure. It was of irrelevance of living a life so carefully constructed that I never truly entered it. The right life had given me safety. It had given me approval. It had given me an explanation. But it had never asked me who I was. And the longer I stayed inside it, the louder that omission became. I didn't know yet what I would do. I didn't have a plan or a dramatic escape. But something inside me had shifted. Correctness was no longer enough. And once that realization took hold, continuing as I was began to feel like a choice, not a default. A choice with a cost I could no longer ignore. I didn't dismantle my life. That's important to say. I didn't quit everything overnight. I didn't disappear. I didn't chase a fantasy version of myself I had never tested. What I did was quieter and far more unsettling. I stopped defending the life I had built. For years, I had explained it to myself with the same rehearsed arguments. This is smart. This is stable. This is what adults do. The moment I stopped repeating those lines, a strange silence appeared. Not relief. Not panic. Space. In that space, I began to hear myself again, not loudly, not clearly, but honestly. I realized how many of my decisions were still being filtered through the same old question: does this fit the life I chose? That question had ruled me for years. So I replaced it with another one. Does this feel true now? That change didn't make things easier. It made them heavier. Because truth carries responsibility. I began making choices that didn't optimize for approval. Small ones at first. Unremarkable to everyone else but radical to me. I said no without over-explaining. I admitted uncertainty without dressing it up as strategy. I allowed myself to want things that didn't come with guarantees. Some people noticed. Not with anger, with confusion. They asked if something was wrong. If I was unhappy. If I was having a crisis. I told them the closest thing to the truth: I'm learning how to listen to myself. That answer didn't reassure anyone. Including me. Because listening to yourself means you don't always like what you hear. There were days when regret came back hard. When I wondered why I hadn't questioned the right life sooner. Why I had waited until everything was so established, so entangled, so heavy. Those thoughts hurt. But they no longer froze me. Because I understood something now that I didn't before: regret is not a verdict. It's information. It tells you where alignment was lost, not that it's impossible to find again. I didn't chase happiness. I chased presence. I didn't look for certainty. I accepted ambiguity. My life didn't suddenly feel meaningful in a cinematic way. It felt inhabited. I began to notice moments instead of managing them. To feel days instead of measuring them. To make choices that might not age well but felt honest now. Some structures in my life loosened. Some relationships shifted. Some identities I had worn comfortably no longer fit. That loss was real. But it was clean. Unlike the slow erosion I had lived with before. I learned that being right can be a powerful hiding place. It protects you from judgment and from yourself. The cost of that protection is subtle but immense. You don't lose your life in one dramatic mistake. You lose it by perfecting a version of yourself that never speaks. If you're listening to this and your life looks correct, respectable, well constructed but feels strangely distant, I want to tell you to burn it down. You don't have to. Start smaller. Question what you defend automatically. Notice what you explain instead of feel. Pay attention to the desires you dismiss because they don't fit your narrative. You're allowed to revise a life that made sense once. Choosing the right life isn't failure. Staying in it long after it stops being true is. I chose the right life. And for a long time, I lived it perfectly. Now, I choose something harder. I choose to live a life that responds to me. Not clean. Not guaranteed. But real. And for the first time, That feels like enough.